Did you ever put your microphone back on Monday?
What do you mean, did I ever put it back on?
Because whenever I joined, I couldn't hear a single thing.
This past Monday?
Yes.
It was on the whole time.
Well, I'll go back and check in. When I was there, and I was there for about 30 minutes, no audio came through at all.
It's unfortunate because the green light was on and everything, so there was no indication to me at all that it was not working. I hate technology.
Yeah, I do too. I was like, I don't know if it's on my end. And then I tested my audio, and my audio was still working, so I don't know what it was.
Well, let me check on the D2L and see.
And it could just be the live stream, but
I don't know. I've checked some of the other videos that have been posted to D2L, and I could hear myself in all of them. All of them where I was listening, wearing a mic, that is. Maybe I wasn't wearing a mic.
I don't think you were, if I'm going to be honest. I was kind of looking to see if maybe you had it on one side, but I didn't see it anywhere on you.
God damn it. And there were like several times when I actually spoke directly to the camera.
It's not funny, but I don't know. I'm in that like last month stretch of stressed out of my mind that everything's funny.
Well, that was my fault, and God. This is such a hard way to teach a fucking class. Oh, well, it's 12:40. So why don't we go ahead and get started? Hopefully some of your classmates will join us. We're heading into the end game, so please don't fall off the face of the earth, although I know it's tempting. And okay. Okay. So I was informed just now that I forgot to wear a mic on Monday, meaning anyone who tuned in could not hear a word that I said, and my deep, deep apologies for that lack of diligence, because there were times when I was speaking directly to the camera, right, Hannah? Wasn't I? Yes, and to no avail, because nobody could hear me. So it's nobody's responsibility but mine to remember to put the mic on. So I have built it into the PowerPoint for Monday, that the very first PowerPoint slide will say, put on your microphone, leaving out all the bad words that could make that much more colorful. So anyway, now the rest of the class this semester is going to be a bit less structured in terms of like our discussion time. We don't have a lot of very clear themes and very clear chapters to correspond to each of those themes, because we're wrapping up Lowen. You have your assignments due on Mondays, and after that we're going to start immediately into your newsletter lesson idea assignments, where you're going to be working with a classmate or two. And this is all stuff that's not news. It's been on the syllabus since day one, but do make sure that you keep checking this, just so you know, no surprises. It doesn't matter how many times you've read these things. I even wrote this, but I still have to look at it like 5 times a week just so I can keep track of where we're at. But yeah, working on the TPS newsletter lesson idea, like all of your predecessors in my 3011 classes have done, is going to be coming right up. Now I'm going to be showing you some examples of what they've done later in today's class, just because they happen to be talking about contextualization. And we're going to be talking about contextualization a bit today. Okay. And then after all that, in the very last week of class, which of course is Thanksgiving week, yeah, we have class Monday and Wednesday that week. That Wednesday being the very last day of class. And so please, I will think of some way to make it worth your while, although it's on Zoom, so I can't bring you virtual brownies. But anyway, and then you're gonna have one more lesson assignment that'll be due as a final during finals week. So obviously we'll wait and talk about that later, because now we're gonna be talking about your third lesson assignment, which I gave the instructions out to people who were physically in class on Monday, and I already had put the instructions on the assignments folder on D2L. So hopefully you all have a copy of that, and if not, you will have one by the end of class today. So, okay, now you had to read for today the last chapter plus the afterword in Lies My Teacher Told Me. So you're all done with the book now. And those are just a couple of very short readings. So hopefully you were able to get all the way through them and think about any kind of parting wisdom that he may have left. So I'm going to share my screen so we can go through the PowerPoint, and I'll probably be going back and forth between this and some of the online web stuff that I wanted to point out. So basically, this is just me coming up with a title that plays off of the actual title of the book that you just read, because, you know, this whole thing about lies my teacher told me. Well, how do you not be that kind of teacher? Now, we did discuss in class on Monday how teachers are under so many pressures from so many different directions, that it's not that they're lying to students, they're trying to do too much with too little. But students could possibly perceive it this way as they proceed through life and find out the real story behind some of the things that their textbooks talked about. And they're like, huh, why didn't I learn that? Well, we actually at Teaching with Primary Sources, MTSU, our graduate assistant for this year has started creating a post every Friday called Why Didn't I Learn That Fridays, where she takes a story from history that is lesser known, and she tells you the story and shows you a primary source to go with it. And it's pretty fun because you are wondering, huh, why didn't I know more about that? And the truth is, there's so much to history that there's never going to be a case where everybody learns everything of interest. That's never going to happen. You as future teachers, those of you who do become future teachers, even if you teach in a way that really engages your students and gets them to learn historical thinking skills, they're still going to forget stuff and later in life be like, why didn't my teacher teach me that? And you're going to be like, I did teach you that. But, you know, so a lot of the stuff is beyond your control. But anyway, what can you do? What can you control? So looking at the theme of chapter 13, what is the result of teaching history like this, which is the straight up chapter title. What did he say were some of the results? And teaching history like this, by that he means, of course, having to follow these textbooks that don't really cover history in a way that historians would cover it if they were actually trying to teach you how to do history. So what are some of the results? And if you want to, you can draw on your own experience, because I'm sure some of you felt like you wished you'd done a bit more in history class, or maybe you had a teacher that did something really great that you thought was a really good example to follow in terms of getting you to really think about something in a way that you hadn't thought of before that really stuck with you. But for starters though, what is the result when you teach history with textbooks that do not engage students with actual history?
I think it becomes more like a trivia class almost, of just like remembering facts and dates and being able to like regurgitate things without having a lot of meaning behind them.
Yeah. So not only can that be boring to many students, but that gives everybody the wrong idea of what history actually is. Who else wants to comment?
It makes students bored of history. It makes them not interested. It makes them kind of, I mean, in a way, it will make them hate it. It'll make them just not enjoy learning about it.
Yeah, they'll find it boring, and that impression that it's boring might follow them and give them a reason to avoid history classes in college that might actually be more interesting to them. It might make them not want to read history books for pleasure later in life. It might make them think that it's useless and doesn't relate to them at all. There are lots of kind of dangerous paths that that line of thinking can go on. Does anyone have any experiences from having learned history in high school that kind of confirms any of that? Or did you all just have model teachers and adequate textbooks?
I was definitely drawing from personal experience, talking about it being like trivia.
Okay.
I know a lot I did not, but after I took the class, I found out that a lot of the people in my history class were cheating on everything. Um, so because it was so difficult, I had to study so much just to do well in that class because it was trivia, like it wasn't even history, and I did not retain much of the information because of how much we had to learn.
Oh yeah. Like I actually did Quiz Bowl as an extracurricular in high school because I was that nerd. And so I mean, even I who love trivia stuff, like when you learn something really fast and in great quantities, you forget it very fast and in great quantities. That's just the way that works. So it leads people to forget it. Um, or it leads to cheating. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah.
I had a social studies teacher one time who, when trying to fill out different countries and where they were and their names and stuff, he would leave the map on the board just so people could cheat on it. He was also a football coach, though. But I mean, I noticed a lot of teachers would result in trying to help make it a little easier just to gain likeness of the students.
So this sounds like some teachers may not really even appreciate this subject as well and pass that along, thinking, oh, this is just something you have to get through, and I pity you that you have to get through this, so I'm going to make it easier on you.
Exactly.
Oh dear, what an impression that leaves.
Yeah, I never had the coaches as teachers, but I know that there was in fact a lot of the standard classes that were taught strictly by coaches. And so I always met people who came out of it like, oh, I mean, they didn't know half of this information that really came with it. It was very interesting to hear their take on history versus the people that I was in AP classes with.
You know, I kind of did both. I remember having I do not know how I ended up in a general world history class taught by a coach, but he was actually like, he was really well loved and well respected. This was at Riverdale in the early 90s. So we all liked him a lot. He had passion for his subject. And then my AP US history teacher, she had a lot of passion for her subject and she was well respected too. So, you know, two different backgrounds, two different style classes. Definitely the tests were two different styles, you know, multiple choice versus essay. But I don't remember anything I learned in either of those classes. And I didn't even learn that I was allowed to question historical sources till I got to graduate school, because I didn't take that many history classes even in college. I had a multidisciplinary major, of which history was just one part. So yeah, even I didn't really kind of learn a lot of the historical thinking skills until graduate school, and most people are not gonna to get that far in history. So yeah, even my own background was really patchy, and then after that I just, you know, history after that, but pardon the pun. So yeah, and of course Lowen uses examples of how when he wants you to answer this question in a negative sense, right? The result of teaching history like this is that students are turned off, they're bored, nobody respects this as a subject, nobody understands how history is actually put together, nobody sees how it relates to their own lives. And then people just tend to, when asked a historical question like who supported the Vietnam War more, more educated people or lesser educated people, people just go on their own assumptions about, oh, well, more educated people would obviously know more and therefore be against the war, which he showed to be wrong. So in fact, in that kind of episode that he's talking about, why is it that the people with more education tended to be more supportive of keeping our troops in the Vietnam War? What's the connection between education and support for a war?
Money.
Can you be more specific?
Yeah. Well, the more educated you are, the chances are you work for like big business or whatever, and in doing so, they big business, they tend to make more money through the
Okay.
patriotic, thing. Over if you're a patriot, you'll buy this and that. It's just that from my own experience, everyone that has an education, they see nothing wrong with protecting the U.S. democracy and all that.
So they're
God,
more invested in the
go.
system?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the points that Lowen makes. That, that education actually leads to a socialization within a system that can lead to complacency with the system and lack of questioning of the system. So in a way, he's kind of confusing, perhaps, because he's telling you that more education is not necessarily a good thing. But here we are just trying to argue that, but we need to educate differently, right? I mean, obviously he thinks education can be a good thing, just not the way that it tends to be. So one of the results of teaching history like this is you have a lot of complacent people who don't question, the government's motives in something, in the case of the Vietnam War. That even people who were initially against sending troops automatically switched to being in favor once troops were already sent. Because at that point, it's too late, right? At that point, it's like, well, we got to support the troops, which, I mean, I think most Americans will agree with. You got to support the troops. But how do you support them? Are you going to support them, I don't know. It's a hard question to ask, to answer. So here's another hard question. So what can we do? What can you do? Even those of you who I know a lot of you said that you don't really want to be high school history teachers or middle school history teachers, or some of you do want to be history teachers, but maybe at a higher level after you've gone through many years of graduate school. Good luck with that. But even if you don't want to be a history teacher, you're going to be disseminating your historical knowledge to some people in some way throughout your life. So keep that in mind and be a good ambassador for historical thinking skills. But what can we do? So I'm going to explore some of the questions that some of the answers that he gives. So for instance, this is straight from, Lowen himself. Introduce fewer topics and examine them more thoroughly. Don't avoid controversy, and back up your interpretations with evidence. Now, what might be some of the difficulties in doing this?
I mean, legally, you have to talk about a certain amount of things if you're in like the public education system. You have to meet those things with the requirements and all of that and cover certain topics.
Yeah.
So it would be harder to kind of narrow things down and still talk about all the things that you're supposed to talk about.
Also, legally, you kind of have to go through the battlefield that is now coming out about like the 1776 Commission and all that, which kind of makes it harder to discuss the controversies.
Okay, so yeah, let me touch on both of those things. Now, it's not like teachers are legally obligated to go through the entire curriculum. It's not a legal issue. It's more of because the standardized tests can be on anything in the curriculum, teachers feel that they have to cover everything so that students will have been exposed to whatever ends up on the test. So there is a concern for testing. Teachers teach towards the test, and teachers are assessed with how they prepare students for tests. So, and who's assessing them? Administrators, not professional historians. So administrators want to see that teachers are covering the curriculum, the whole curriculum. And so it can impact their job performance, and it can impact student performance on tests to do this. Now, the tests are constantly being redesigned, and so even if, you know, some I've seen some of the tests, just of some of the kinds of questions that they ask, and they might show like an excerpt from a text and then ask you to write a short answer about it or answer a historical question about it. And if you haven't covered that particular piece of content, then you might not have the context that you need to answer it. However, if you have the skills for how to read a primary source, you can at least answer it somewhat. And so what Lowen is saying here is that if you teach students how to approach historical questions, what to ask about both the primary and the secondary sources they encounter, and then how to put it all together, they should be able to tackle any historical issue that comes their way. Because what do? Well, I mean, nowadays you just look stuff up on your phone. But the point is not, can they remember, you know, oh my gosh, we didn't have a chance to get to the Cold War because it was the end of the year. How are they ever going to be able to answer a question about the Vietnam War? Well, if you teach them how to analyze multiple perspectives, they can handle answering that kind of question. So it's the whole give a man a fish, he eats for a day, teach a man to fish, he eats forever kind of idea behind that. And this is, you know, I'm trying to teach you all historical thinking skills because, and it's like, I'm not trying to teach you content. That's not the point of this class. You are picking up a lot of content, you know, in certain different random episodes in history, but that's not the point. If you can learn how to analyze a primary source and what context is and what subtext is, then I'm confident I don't have to show you how to do that for every single historical topic covered in the standards. You need to be able to apply that skill to anything that you come across. And so, you know, the only way to do it is to take more time. And the only way to do that is to cut some things out. And teachers cut things out all the time because they, like I said, they don't get through the whole standards because of all the different pressures on teaching throughout the year. Think about this year. Who knows how far through the standards these poor teachers got, having to deal with distance learners, COVID concerns, lysoling their classrooms between every single class, making sure all the desks are 6 feet apart. I mean, and wearing personal protective equipment while they're trying to cover content standards. There's no way they got through all of those. And so you can't make them legally on the hook for every curriculum standard they get to, because they never get to all the ones at the end. But yeah, and then the whole thing about don't avoid controversy. Yeah, now that we have, it's entered public discourse, the perceived dangers of teaching critical race theory to adults and to students, and how that makes everything having to do with most things in American history controversial. So teaching controversial things like they're not controversial is in itself going to be pretty difficult. So yeah. What about back up your interpretations with evidence? What might be some of the difficulties with that?
finding evidence that'll kind of go along with, okay, so finding evidence that'll go along with your interpretations, but also getting your students to understand it while trying to also explain it.
So where does evidence come from?
Primary sources a lot of the times. But I feel like, I don't know, a lot of when you're in like high school or middle school and everything, you're not exactly used to reading primary sources, and it can be time consuming, and teachers will have to explain different things and context and just a lot. I don't know.
Yeah.
It would be hard to back up a lot of interpretations of history and have to find all of that different evidence.
Yeah, even having students back up their interpretations with evidence from a textbook is a hard thing to teach because of the whole concept of just backing up your what an interpretation even is, what evidence really even is a hard thing to teach to people. But yeah, and then what if you're trying to gather, because then the teacher has to gather the evidence from the primary sources, and that's very time consuming. Or, you know, evidence can come from secondary sources as well. You know, if you've ever footnoted something in one of your own essays from a secondary source, then you've done that. But even that means looking for additional sources. So this whole thing about being able to evaluate both primary and secondary sources, that's a very difficult skill, but it's necessary in order to be able to back up an argument. This is the thing. This is where, you know, Lowen says you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And so I think that there's a lot of work involved here, and there are a lot of people who don't put in the work. And so they think interpretation is just something that they can base all on their own assumptions. But even your own assumptions come from somewhere. And that's where you have to think about your own patterns of thinking. And that's where the word metacognition comes in, where we brought that up earlier in the semester. So, okay, so how do we teach students to evaluate primary and secondary sources? Now, you know, we've been talking about this all semester, but I do have some additional points to think about that. He uses the phrase crap detector. So, and he is using this to refer to reading textbooks. Like when you're reading secondary and tertiary sources, how do you know you're reading a good source? And so these are the questions that you ask. Now, they're the same kinds of questions, or at least most of them are, that you would ask about a primary source. I mean, if you remember, we asked a lot of the same, we did the same text, context, subtext exercise with, you know, a patriot's history or a people's history of the United States that we would with a primary source text or image. When and why is it written? Whose viewpoint is represented? And talking about textbooks in, you know, in particular here, is this account believable? Is it backed up by other sources, or is it contradicted by other sources? And if so, how would you explain the contradiction? You know, that's the thing about primary sources. Primary sources are evidence, but that doesn't mean that they are all pure facts. They're not. It's a fact that they exist, but it's not a fact whatever they say, because some of them will say two completely different things. You know, who shot first at the Battle of Lexington, the British or the Americans? So you have to figure out, well, how am I going to evaluate these so I know which ones to believe in that sense and which ones that I can explain away in a different sense. And then how is one supposed to feel about the America that has been presented? So you can see that that's a question specifically for evaluating textbooks of American history there. But also, like, if you guys are reading any kind of biographies of famous people or anything like that, does it make you, like, especially with like presidents and stuff, sometimes people will write, you know, very negative books about public figures, and then sometimes they'll write very positive books about public figures. It doesn't mean that everything they say is trustworthy, and it also doesn't mean that everything they say is not trustworthy. But it's just another one of those pieces of context that you have to keep in mind when you're evaluating the things that they say. Now these, remember, these are questions when you're reading a book about history, when you're doing a research, when you're looking for evidence. Now these are boiled down to 3 other questions that I'm going to show you. This is the way that they put it, the Stanford History Education group that I'm going to show you in just a sec. Who's behind the information? What's the evidence? And what do other sources say? So you can see that who's behind the information. This is the subtext question that Bruce Lesh asks all the time. You know, where was this in Abraham Lincoln's career that he says that he is in support of keeping the Union together, you know, whether you freed the slaves or not? You know, it makes a difference in what context he says something. So who's behind the information when applying this to, and this is specifically to things that you might find online. What kind of questions, I mean, how many of you, when you like look for stuff online, ask this question, who's behind this information? How do you even find that out? All right, well, let's think about that in a sec. Anyway, so these are the questions that are asked. I'm bringing some civic online reasoning into this because this is something that I wanted to make sure I showed you all exists. And this is from the Stanford History Education group. So, you know what, I'm just gonna, like, for instance, so if you go to Stanford History Education group, you see they have Reading Like a Historian that has lesson plans. They have Beyond the Bubble, which is history assessments, and they have Civic Online Reasoning curriculum. So that's how you get there. What?
You're still on the PowerPoint.
Oh, thank you. All right, let me go back. All right, so the Stanford History Education group. This is the website when you Google it. Here's Reading Like a Historian. I've already showed you, you know, the John Smith Pocahontas lesson that we had at the very beginning comes from here. Beyond the Bubble history assessments. Civic Online Reasoning curriculum is here. So this is where you get these 3 big questions. Who's behind the information? What's the evidence? And what do the sources say? Now, this is specifically because they did an 18-month-long study of high school and I believe college students as well to evaluate how well those people could evaluate online sources. And what do you think they found? Students are awful at it. That's what they found. And professors are actually not as good at it as professional fact checkers. So I know fact checking is a really huge thing now because you just can't trust everything that you read on the internet. I think we all know that. So the problem that, of course, you all face is there's too much information. So the skills that are really needed is how to evaluate information in terms of how trustworthy it is for the particular piece of information that you're using. So these are the questions that you ask about that. So when you guys are coming up with your lesson assignments for Monday and you're picking pieces of context to include, You want to make sure, like I always say, get it from a legitimate source. So if you get something off the Library of Congress, who's behind the information there? Somebody who works at the Library of Congress. So what's their whole purpose? Presenting well-researched information to the American public for educational reasons, right? The Library of Congress is not trying to sell you something, except for a tote bag in a gift shop. But it's really, really hard because a lot of websites look so legitimate, and they even have legitimate names. And people, even people like me, get confused, especially if they're reading something that they want to believe or they want very much not to believe. So I think we've all run into that a lot lately. But then you ask, what's the evidence? So just because a site uses footnotes doesn't mean they're totally legitimate, you know? You got to see what sources are they using. Does this site without footnotes still have really good content? So just because something is using footnotes does not necessarily mean it's using better evidence. And then what do other sources say? So you can't just read one thing, even if it's from the Library of Congress, you know, looking at some of the other pages that you find and see where they get their stuff. Now, there are a lot of videos that are pretty helpful. And this isn't just for this class. This is for any class that you guys might use. How to use Wikipedia wisely, what is lateral reading. And then they partnered up with John Green from Crash Course, which is a website that a YouTube channel that I tend to recommend. And so he's talking about fact checking and navigating digital information quite a bit. And so those are all good resources for when you're trying to evaluate, because context comes from, you know, primary sources come without context. So where does context, you know, it comes, this is what people have written to make sense of primary sources. So ideally, somebody has looked at enough primary sources to be able to interpret them in a very accurate way. But you can't check on all of that. So how do you kind of check on whether or not it's trustworthy? So these are just kind of, you know, clues to help you with that. Okay, so since we're talking about contextualization, and by the way, you guys are, you're doing a good job at not asking a lot of questions here. We might end early today. So you're like, oh good, maybe if we all just like don't say anything else, we'll end extra early. Yeah, but do you really just want to hear me talk? No, okay. So what is contextualization? Because this is one of these words that's like, the first time I ever heard it, I was a senior in college and my TA wrote it on the board and he kind of made fun of it as being a grad student word. You know, it's a word that you learn when you get to grad school and then you just feel so smart when you say it that, you know, grad students would be walking around talking about contextualization all the time. But that was back in the 90s. And I think nowadays it's trickled down and you actually hear about it in high school, putting things into context. Now, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to do that? So this, of course, you've seen many, many times where he's very specific in how he defines context here. But contextually,
We're still on the other web page.
Shit. God, I hate Zoom so much. Do you see the PowerPoint now? Okay, so you've definitely seen this before. And contextualization actually refers to this whole, this is all a sourcing exercise, and sourcing and contextualization kind of go hand in hand, because sourcing is where you're trying to figure out what's the story behind this source. You guys did that for all the different things for Lexington Green. You did that for John Smith and Pocahontas. You did that for a lot of the other activities that we did in class already. But the context part is what's going on during this time period that helps explain the information found in the source. So context helps these primary sources make sense. So we're going to look at a couple examples of that. Now, all these other questions under subtext, they also go along with the idea of contextualization, because you have to ask, when was it written, who created it, what was their deal, that kind of thing. Okay, so almost everything on this slide was copied directly from the checklist for today's class. So I'm going to assume that you have all seen this before, because you all check the checklist every time. I did add one thing though. I added, without hyperlinking it, I'll do that before I post this, another video. Now, show of hands, show of thumbs ups. How many of you have watched this video on historical context? No. Okay, we're gonna do that. It's very short. And actually, I think I'll show you the one on contextualization, and then you can go find the other one pretty easily. So I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint, share the website, and go to the YouTube page. Okay, so I was in the middle of rewatching the historical context one. I am going to go to contextualization. We're going to watch this. I'm going to share my computer's sound. And lastly, criminally, where's okay, before I do this, it's not coming up for me. Hold on. What I need to do, y'all, is I need to pause the recording, because YouTube won't let me post a video if I have a video in it, right? So let me pause the recording.
Hello. Today we're going to talk about the day that King met Nick.
Sorry, it just started automatically playing the next video in that playlist, which was the drunk history video about when Elvis met Nixon. So that was what that was. Anyway. So, okay. So how does that video define contextualization?
Take a look at kind of the wider aspects of the time, the area, the situation of the person, the situation of the state. It means like taking into context of what's going on elsewhere than that person's home. Okay. You're situating that person in a specific time, in a specific place, and talk about what's going on, right? Okay. So how does that little lesson, which actually, you can find on their website, it's the Kansas housewife thing, where this housewife, Mrs. Lathrop, in 1921 writes this letter to Thomas Edison in which she talks about all of her wonderful appliances in her house. And she's married to a doctor, and obviously she can afford more than most of the people who she lived near.
so how does this activity use context in order to say, no, she was not typical?
Well, they talk about how a lot of other people didn't even have electricity and how she was, you know, a minority that actually had the ability to use devices like that.
Yeah. So they looked at the census, they looked at the population density, they looked at, you know, whether or not she lived in a rural place or an urban place, and whether or not most people on farms even had electricity in 1921 in Kansas. And most of them who lived on farms at that time did not. So if you don't have electricity, you can't have all those wonderful home appliances that she's talking about. Now, one thing that I thought was kind of funny, the pictures that they showed you, those black and white pictures that you were viewing while you were listening to them talking, those are from the Farm Security Administration Office of War Information collection from the Library of Congress from TVA. They're specifically their photographs about the wonders about how TVA is bringing electricity to rural areas. And the woman with that thing that looked like a roll of paper towels was actually an iron. And then the man, you know, holding up, I forget what it was, toaster or something. His name is Mr. Bacon. There's actually a ton of pictures of Mr. Bacon in the TVA collection, and he and his wife are just showing off all of their home appliances in the 1930s in Knoxville, Tennessee. So those pictures are from over a decade later in a different part of the country for people experiencing rural electrification. And of course, they're kind of government propaganda showing how wonderful it is that people are getting electricity through things like the Tennessee Valley Authority, which doesn't start till like 1933 or something. So again, if you want to use some extra context and figure out what messages that video is trying to send, sorry. Okay, so that would be an example of the type of thing that you could create in your lesson assignment. All right, let's take this source, let's ask a question about it, and let's situate it in time and place to try to figure out how it makes sense. So let's look at a couple more examples of that. All right. Yeah, okay. Now, the checklist also refers to these close reading exercises at the Teaching of Primary Sources MTSU website, where there's lots of context clues trying to work in there to explain what you're reading. So I mentioned at the end of class on Monday, this one by Henry David Thoreau on civil disobedience. And yeah, I'm distracted right now because, like, if you listen to documentaries where people talk about him, they say thorough instead of Thoreau, like thorough. So it makes me feel kind of poncy to say it that way. I'm just going to acknowledge that some people who I guess are more in the know than I am say Henry David Thoreau. I am just going to say Thoreau, and I apologize for, you know, whoever is hearing me that knows the correct way to pronounce it. Okay. So for instance, you know, he's writing, if you just read, under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison. The proper place today, the only place which Massachusetts has provided for her freer and less desponding spirits, is in her prison. To be put out and locked out of the state by her own act, as they have already put themselves out by their principles. Excuse me. It is there that the fugitive slave and the Mexican prisoner on parole and the Indian come to plead the wrongs of his race should find them on that separate but more free and honorable ground where the state places those who are not with her but against her, the only house in a slave state in which a free man can abide with honor. So if we just took that primary source excerpt from Civil Disobedience, what can we say about it? Well, we can say, you know, because that's very tough language. So if we're just trying to put it in our own words, we would say, well, if the government is imprisoning people for reasons that are morally wrong, then it stands to reason that the true place for morally right people is in prison. This means there is a higher authority determining what is right and wrong than the government and laws. So that's me just reading a passage for what it's logically implying. So that's close reading. He says prison is the proper and only place for people who put their principles above the laws of the state. So to be free from prison is to live according to the state and its unjust laws. So unless you're in prison, you're contributing to the problem. So again, that's trying to interpret just that primary source chunk. So what context is going to help us realize what's going on here? Well, what do y'all know about Henry David Thoreau?
Well, didn't he write this like while he was in prison or shortly after he was in?
Yes, so he actually has firsthand experience of having been in prison.
He just there for like one night.
Yes,
Yeah.
for like one night. And do you know why?
He didn't pay taxes of some kind, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And does anyone know when this is? So this is where, you know, these kinds of questions are answered by, oh, look, here's some context. This is what context looks like here. So, I mean, he's best known for writing Walden. Walden, you know, where he goes and he lives by a pond in the wilderness in Massachusetts. And he's like, oh, I'm going to do this simplified lifestyle. And some of the context for that is that he is influenced by the Transcendentalist movement. So that's part of the larger context. But while he's there, this is the mid 1850s. While he's there, he's arrested for not paying his poll tax. And he says he didn't pay it on purpose out of protest against the Mexican-American War, which was fought from 1846 to 1848, as well as against slavery. So when you're thinking about the time and place in which he's writing this in Massachusetts, which is a state that actually has a lot of abolitionist sentiment in the 1840s and the 1850s. You know, slaveholding is not a thing in Massachusetts anymore, but it is a thing. And this is the time of increased sectionalism in the United States leading up to the Civil War. And the Mexican-American War is a huge part of the context for his writing Civil Disobedience. So he only spent one night in jail because a relative bailed him out, supposedly against his wishes. And then he went back and then he wrote this essay called, he didn't call it Civil Disobedience. Somebody called it that after he was dead. But this, and then if you want to talk about, you know, the legacy of this, it actually, this is one of the things that inspires Gandhi and Martin Luther King in nonviolent resistance against the state. Okay, so if you look at that context, I'm sorry, this is the exact same excerpt. It's just repeated because this is putting it into your own words. This is close reading, and then this is context. So, so basically, this contextual note is comparing it to something that sounds almost the same from Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. And then it's also just explaining what some of these words or phrases might mean to students who might not realize what the state means, because they might think the state means just Massachusetts or just Tennessee, but you know, the state can refer to this kind of entity of government. And here's a piece of context. The fugitive slave law was passed a year after this essay was released, 1849. It was passed in 1850, and he actually gave lectures against it. So knowing that he's very, very vocally anti-slavery helps you to interpret what, that's why he brings up the fugitive slave, right? This is something that is so important that it becomes enshrined in law just shortly after this essay. And he's an abolitionist, and he was protesting because he didn't want his tax dollars to support what he thought was an unjust war fought for slavery. And this is during the presidency, let's see, this war was during the presidency of James K. Polk, who himself was a slaveholder. And he basically did this. One of the reasons was to bring Texas into the Union as a slaveholding state, and therefore it upset the balance of the slave and free states and created a lot of discord in Congress. He also believed in limited government, and he just disapproved of US aggression in any other country. And if you actually read the very first sentence of this very, very long essay, the very first sentence says that government is best which governs least. So the whole idea that the state shouldn't be so far reaching is something that helps you interpret this as well. Okay, so my point here is that you cannot understand this essay without understanding that it's against the whole backdrop of slavery in America and the state's support of slavery, and therefore the state's support of an unjust system, and how do you even protest that? So that's an example of how to make context and make more sense of your primary source excerpt. Now, I'm gonna go back to the PowerPoint really quickly because I wanna show you, which, you know, is something that you would have seen that I added these in the checklist. And this is where you guys get a preview of your next assignment. The previous 3011 classes have created little things about contextualization for the TPS MTSU newsletter. So I'm going to show you an example of a couple of those by popping out of there and popping back into the website and waiting for the black bar to go away. Okay. All right, so this is what, when I say there's a newsletter lesson thing coming up, this is what it looks like. You know, our newsletters all look like this. We create these every month, and once a year, the newsletter is created by you guys in 3011. This is the 6th edition of Historical Thinking. Y'all will be doing the 7th, right? Yeah, because this is, yeah, this was, and then the one that you guys do will actually be published as the January 2021 newsletter. So here's my class last year, and they did these 4 lesson things. So they were divided into 4 groups, and one of them chose change over time. And then here's the contextualization one that we'll come back to. Continuity and change. You can see these are different things that are part of the social studies practices standards, and I will give you a list of things to choose from, and your group will choose. And then one did historical empathy. And then each of the 4 groups, in addition to that half a page long thing, had to do one of these, what we call blurbs, on page 4, where they pick another one from a list that I give you. And they're like, okay, well, I choose this primary source. This is an audio recording. It's a song. And then they write a blurb about it that talks about how you use this to talk about the skill of finding the author's purpose. So that's what y'all are going to do after this next lesson idea. But as an example to see how people in this class before you have tackled contextualization, this one looks at the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. And this is the one that I mentioned before. If you've seen the HBO show, The Watchmen, it starts with a fictionalized view of what that would look like from the point of view of a little boy. So I'm not going to show it because I don't feel like having to edit that out later. But you can go to this newsletter from our website and you can find it. All of our newsletters are under newsletters, and this one is, where is it? Oh yeah, January's on the bottom. There it is. And this is the one that talks about the Tulsa Race Massacre. Okay, so where was I? Oh man, go away, go away, go away, go away. There we go. Okay, now, so basically they're starting off by showing this clip to students and having them be like, okay, well, what do you already know? You know, assessing prior knowledge and that kind of thing. And then, okay, well, what do we know about what's going on in 1921? And then they link to a couple different places where you can read about what's going on. There's a whole website about the neighborhood that was destroyed was called Greenwood. So that's where you can read about it. And then they have another link from the Oklahoma Historical Society. And so this is a good place to get kind of an overview of what actually happened. And so once students have done that, then they're supposed to fill out this printable worksheet. And so this is something that was created for a National History Day competition. So the theme of that was taking a stand in history. So it's not something that you have to actually use for, you know, the theme, but this whole idea of little c context and big C context is supposed to be, okay, well, what's the context for, you know, what's happening immediately around that person, and then what's happening larger in the nation. And so basically the whole point of this is that you're, you know, after listening to this and reading some more articles, you're finding out that in the 1920s, there was a resurgence of the KKK. And that's a very important piece of historical context for understanding what happened during the Tulsa race riot. And we talked a bit about this resurgence of the KKK. Remember, it was something that actually was inspired by the Birth of a Nation film and the whole sentiment in the nation when Birth of the Nation came out in 1915 that portrayed the KKK as whites, you know, white knights on horses coming in to save the day. And then some discussion questions. And then they bring this into the African American history curriculum standards, as well as the US history, and then the social studies practice. Okay, and then just one more example that I want to show you of 3011 students tackling the issue of contextualization. Here's one the year before where they're looking at the theme of the conservation movement in the early 20th century as espoused by Teddy Roosevelt. And so, you know, they're talking about this as a reaction to the Second Industrial Revolution, which it would be the big C context for why Americans suddenly care so much about preserving this beautiful parkland, right? Why would they care if they didn't think that it was about to be lost? And so industrialization is a catalyst for that. Anyway, sorry about that. I have to let that go. So you can see they define contextualization according to the Stanford History Education Group. And then they are like, we'll read 2 pages of this essay about the, you know, from this collection at the Library of Congress about wilderness reserves. And so, you know, you read that and then you read this. And then they are saying, okay, well then talk about the sources and then talk about the steps taken by people like John Muir. And look, here's Roosevelt and John Muir together at Yosemite. So these two men actually had a relationship. He's the founder of the Sierra Club, which is still around today as an environmental organization. And then, you know, looking at, okay, well, let's look at the Industrial Revolution and talk about how that influences the movement for conservation. So that's kind of how they tackled that. So you can see that this is more of an explanation to a teacher of what a lesson would be like. So it's not the exact same thing as what y'all are doing for your a lesson assignment due on Friday. I am actually, I'm gonna bring that up. So let me get those, what's the word? Instructions. Let me pull up the instructions on screen right now so that we can just look at them and you can ask any questions that you have. Hang on, I'm just popping into D2L. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. So you're looking at, this is the student banner form of D2L. So this is what you see. Under content, assignments. It's at the bottom, of course, because it's the most recent. So here it is. And remember, it's almost exactly the same as before. The only thing on this numbered list that is different is that you now have to do a product. And I did say, don't just choose essay because it's the easiest thing to assign. You know, obviously, if you have a good investigative question, the easiest thing for them to create that you would have to grade would be, oh, well, I'm going to write a 5-page essay answering the investigative question. Now, that would be a good match. You're definitely matching the product to the investigative question, which is important. You don't want to have them answer something that they didn't spend all lesson learning. But remember, you're going to have to grade it. So think about that. That will come into your calculations so much more than you thought it would. So it's something that you're going to have to assess. I'm not saying you don't have to choose an essay. I'm just saying you can think about other things, possibilities, even if it's just like a short answer or something else. You can even create your own worksheet if you want and have them fill that out. I know some of you actually already did that for some previous lessons. So that's totally something that you can do. Okay, and then, you know, include context and subtext within the larger heading of contextualization. This is the same. You want to do it clearly labeled, clearly numbered, and then resources to help with teaching this skill. Well, you've just seen these both, okay? Now I want to really hammer home that the most important thing to me about this assignment is to see that you all understand the historical thinking skill. Because I think that some of you got maybe a bit too carried away with the process in doing the last one, that you kind of lost sight of the multiple perspectives, which was the historical thinking skill that I really wanted you to hammer home. So please make sure that in this lesson, you are teaching students not only what is contextualization, but you're teaching them how to do it. You are going to take a primary source or 2 or 3 or whatever, and you're going to make students have to make sense of those using pieces of context. Now, that doesn't just mean here's a primary source, here's an essay from the Library of Congress, put them together and what do you get? That's making them do too much work. How much are you going to give them? At what time in the process are you going to give them a little bit of knowledge for it, maybe like a tiny blurb at the beginning, and then see what they can come up with and then fill it in for them? Are you going to show them, oh, you thought this came from here? This quote actually came from here. Why did you think it came from here? Make them kind of surprised at their own assumptions until they learn the real context. Sometimes that works too. So there's lots of different ways you can do this. And there's so many different there's so many different lessons that have already done this before you, so you might want to see how other people have approached it. So, you know, like I said, you can check out the newsletters, you can check out lesson plans, you can, oh yeah, this is the soldiers in the Philippines. This is the lesson plan from the Stanford History Education Group that goes with the video on historical context. You know, they're talking about a source, it's actually from this one. But yeah, so you can look at the lessons here. If you go to Beyond the Bubble, History Assessments, you can actually go to Contextualization, and they have 77 examples of how they have included that skill into something they can use to assess student learning. Now, in order to access these, remember, you just have to create a login. That means leave your name and your email. That's it. But if you view the assessment, wait, can you even, you know, this is an example of using context, this background information to examine this photograph. We actually have a lesson plan on this one as well, because this is the most famous photograph at the Library of Congress. Big surprise, right? But, you know, what's the context of this photograph? This woman and her family actually were not happy at the way that most people perceive this photograph, because it perceives her as a hopeless victim who is just sitting there, you know, poor and destitute. And actually, they just stopped by this camp because their car tire got flattened on the highway, and they stopped by this camp for a day while two of her kids went to go change the tire. And then Dorothy Lang shows up and just starts taking pictures of her. And, you know, they actually drive away from this camp later. And she actually, her name is Flores Thompson. She was like 32 years old. She's a Native American, and she like was an activist for labor organizing and workers' rights. So there's a whole story here that helps this picture make more sense, and it may not be what you thought was the real story behind it. So that's an example. Anyway, so before I load more onto you, do you have any questions about your assignment due on Monday? I haven't created the Dropbox yet, but I will do that this afternoon.
If we include like a worksheet or whatever, do we have to fill out the worksheet with answers, were you saying? Or
you don't. I mean, okay, that's for overachievers, which, you know, if you want to be that, that's fine. But no, I never expect you to create a teacher's guide. Some people have. We, on most of ours, we don't do that. I think there's only been 2 times when we've created a, well, this is what teacher answers might be. But most of the time we just create the worksheet.
And this is due Monday, right? Because I thought you said Friday, but it says on the paper the 9th.
It's Monday.
Okay, good.
Any other questions about it? You all can email me any individual questions that you have, you know that. Okay. Well, if nobody else has any more questions, then we can end 10 minutes early. Okay. All right. Thanks, y'all.